This conference is now being recorded.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the New York ASBO webinar, Managing Employees. My name is Matthew Darius. I'm the Senior Staff Associate for Professional Development here at ASBO, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Your speaker for today's program is, again, Jeff Lefson from Staff Development Associates. Operator assistance is available at any time during this conference by pressing £0. If at any time you have a question for Jeff, you can press £7 on your phone, and I'll put you through the room. You can ask it right over the phone, or you can use the chat window to the right of the main screen. At this time, I'm going to turn the call over to Jeff. Please begin.
Well, thank you, Matthew. You got to convert control over to me too.
Yeah, there's a little bit of lag on the internet today for some reason.
Not a problem.
Should have it.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back for I guess round 2 of our discussion about issues relating around employees. In my last session, I focused on issues around how to supervise employees, and in particular, how to address poor performance, how to look at situations like how you establish norms within your school district and certainly within your department. Today's session is going to focus a little bit different approach. We're going to look at some issues around customer service. Now, at first blush, you might think to yourself, how does this really relate to employees? But I'm going to give you a context for this. Clearly, one of the things that's always an issue in school districts is how to make sure that all of our staff are providing their best possible image and best possible relationship with all of the stakeholders, both internally and externally. In order for you to be able to train and coach and supervise staff, you need to be informed about some of these basics. So what I'm going to do is go over some basic concepts about customer service, and then I'm going to talk in particular about how you can utilize those in terms of what you do at your staff meetings, how you really can kind of support these notions. Because just simply telling people to be courteous is really not what it's about. In fact, as you'll see as I go on, courtesy I take as a given in customer service. In fact, most misconnections between customers and a school district or a department are really more about weak systems. And not necessarily about courtesy or people being very nice. Let me start by the onset by posing this question. And by the way, just a little background, I've been doing quite a bit of training for a number of years on customer service for a lot of different school employees. One of the things that my firm does is provides training for educational office professionals, for secretaries. And one of our most popular topics is customer service. And I've done this all over the country, and I see things that are kind of common strands wherever I go. So some of the stuff comes from that, and I've certainly also done training on this topic for administrators as well. So usually what I like to do when I begin any training is to ask a kind of a reflective question about this issue. And so I'll often ask my audience, and this, by the way, in doing all of this, I want to kind of model some good strategies for you to use with your staff and staff meetings. So this is certainly a good question to pose to your staff as well in a meeting, which is, what is good service? Because we'll often talk about service maybe being poor, but we really don't always focus on what good service really is, you know. So I'll often ask people, and I know that from my prior webinars I didn't get a lot of feedback. I'm still going to try to ask for kind of direct feedback, but even if I don't get it, I'll share with you the kinds of things that I've learned in prior sessions or things that people have said, because I know the webinar culture is kind of you lay back, so I'll take that for granted. But anyway, so often I ask people to reflect on this question, what is good service? And I usually do that by asking them to think of an organization that's provided them with good service in the past. And I'll say this certainly could be a public sector organization, could be a company, etc. And while I don't mind people giving me a shout-out positively about an organization they work with, what I'm really more interested in is what they say felt for them as good service. So I'm going to give you all a few seconds to reflect on that. I assume you all have pen and pencil out, whether you decide to respond to me. Think of an organization that's given you good service. What is it that they did that was good service? And then after you do that, I'll hone in on some of the things that people have shared with me. By the way, sometimes I don't get a lot of good responses to this, So I'll pose the question in reverse, and I'll ask them to think of an organization that had given them terrible service, and what was that like? What was the awful thing that they did? So whichever one works for you, I'll share a little bit of both, okay? So I'm going to go silent for a few seconds to let you go work on that. Okay, well, they say that webinars are poor dead air, so I won't give you as long as I usually provide. Usually if I do this with staff, just again because we're kind of in a how do you really use these strategies to train your own staff, I usually would give people about 5 or 6 minutes. This is not a long activity. And then I'd ask them to, share some examples of what they thought was good service. So I'll try. Let's see if I get anything from anybody. Anybody willing to share with me some experience they had that was good service? I know it's a little hard to do this third hand. I think you can certainly type it in, or we can go audio with it. So anybody want to share anything? And what was it?
Either type it in on the chat pane, or you can hit 7# if you want to talk to Jeff.
Yep.
Okay, we have Michelle.
Okay.
Are you there?
Yes, I am. So,
All right, go ahead.
Hi, Michelle. Yes.
I have a bank that I deal with that really has provided me with good customer service. They're, not only have they given me good rates to work with, but they're very willing to. They come to me rather than making me come to them. They're always willing to come to me for meetings and for signatures, and they don't make me do all the work, basically.
Okay, thank you. And in fact, that is a common one that I hear that people talk about when they talk about good service. And in fact, I've heard it framed both ways, either on the positive or the negative. So I'll start with what I've often heard in terms of the negative. What they'll say is, when I have and again, you didn't necessarily talk about a problem, but they'll often address it in terms of a problem. When I had some kind of a problem, what they told me were things like the following: you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this. In organizations that provide good service, they got a sense that the organization, the people who are the service providers, that they would own it. So they would say, I will take care of that. I will look into that. I will follow up. And in keeping what you said, they will come to you. They will bring the papers ready to sign. They won't say, you have to come to me with this and this and this. So I think that's an excellent example. You're only going to get an applause from one person here, but that's an excellent example of good service. The organization taking ownership of the mission, of the problem, or just ownership of making sure that things get done. Anybody else have one? Maybe we'll get one more example.
We have one in the chat from Wendy. She says, a local restaurant where the manager came to the table just to check in.
And I think that's good, too. I remember being an old New York City guy, Koch saying, how am I doing? I think that when organizations take the time to find out if everything is going well, if everything worked out for me, I think that's certainly an example of good service. So those are certainly both good examples of good service. Anybody else? Or I think you gave me definitely some stuff to work with. But anybody else have anything else they want to share?
There's no one on chat or audio, but I threw it on the chat pane, Amazon.com. They listen to your concerns and they solve your issue the first time on the first call to your satisfaction, and they don't let you off the phone until you're completely satisfied.
And that's excellent, too. One of the things that really frustrates people is when especially if they've been transferred around to first find you, is if they're told, oh, you got to call this number and you got to call that number. This sense of once you come to me, I now own the problem. or I'm going to stick with you until we find a solution, can be very important. Now, of course, sometimes from a pragmatic point of view, that may not always be possible within a school district because, frankly, we have divisions of labor. But I think there are still ways that we can do this. For example, one thing that I really like about American Express is when they hand you off to another department, they always stay on the line with you. And so in some of the districts that I've worked with, where now if a caller calls up, say, a wrong department, instead of simply being told, I'm going to transfer you, and again, this is assuming the technology will do this, but we need to make sometimes good choices even when we're choosing technology, but having a situation where we can pass a customer off. So say, hold on, I'm gonna check with the people in that department. I have so-and-so on the line, and then you pass it off, as opposed to just throwing someone into the great abyss and wondering if they're, my experience is you transfer more than 3 times, you're probably going to be cut off anyway. But that kind of level of ownership, very important, especially with somebody where they've already had a negative experience. We really need to make sure we take ownership.
And we have one last one from Carrie.
I'm loving it. Go ahead.
She says, it's good when customer needs are addressed promptly, or at least given feedback as to its progress.
Excellent, and actually that's another one that we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk in a few minutes about what are the elements of good service, and one of them is responsiveness. Now, the truth is that sometimes we cannot give people what they want, because what they want is frankly illegal or not in their best interest or against policy. But it's important that we give those answers, even if those are not what people want to hear, that they get those on a prompt basis, that they don't have to wait. Okay, that's terrific. So what I try to do, and again, as much as possible in these sessions, I'm trying to give you resources that you can use. So here's a good poster that you can, and we can certainly send you a copy of it electronically so you can blow it up bigger if you request it. But here's one of my favorite slides of all, and that is that organizations that provide good service make it easy to be a customer, okay? And I have to tell you, I often ask this as a provocative question. I've certainly done a lot of customer service training in districts and in some of the BOCES as well, is I asked this question. I was doing work at the BOCES recently, and I posed the question. Now, I'm not suggesting they weren't good at this, but this is the kind of provocative question that you need to ask your staff and yourselves, and that is, if one of your customers has a problem, do they look forward to calling you or dread calling you? Now, and why would they feel one way or another? So clearly, they would look forward to calling you if, in anticipation of dialing you, the assumption they made is you would be able to solve their problem. So if somebody's having a difficulty and they're confused about something or frustrated about something, and they say, no problem, I'll call that office, they'll help me. Or do they say, I have to deal with them again? So there's already a presumed negative on the part of the person. Now, in all fairness, how somebody feels about that may be a function of their prior experiences, for example, before you arrived, or their experiences overall with a lot of other organizations or preconceived notions about bureaucracies in the public sector. But anything that we can do, certainly on a one-to-one basis with each one of these customers, to get to the point where they actually say, this is terrific. I'm going to call those people. They will help me. They can almost feel like, as they're dialing, a sense of relief as opposed to a sense of trepidation. So again, I'll kind of open it up. Anybody have a comment they want to make about that experience? Maybe if you've ever had to deal with a state agency, I hear people often go, oh, I have to deal with them again. So I'll stop for a minute and just see if we have any comments on that. Okay, moving right along. Let me suggest to you that your job is not easy. And this is something that I think is also important to point out to staff. When things are working, people tend to take them for granted. Now, the classic example that I always give, and certainly I think this is true of business office operations in general, but I want to extend this out not just to business or direct business office operations, but within the whole service end of schools, the non-instructional end of schools. So the example I always give is facilities. So the example I give is you walk into a room and all of the lights are on and the temperature is perfect. and the floors are clean and everything is in order, you probably don't think to turn around to the custodian in the building or the maintenance guy in the building and say, thank you for the wonderful job you did to make this room work. You don't do that because, frankly, if it's working, you don't think about it. On the other hand, if you walk into that room and it's freezing or the lights are flickering or you have to, in my case, to do a presentation and there's no extension cord, then, of course, I'm going to be running to look for somebody to help me. So if you're in the role of administration, and that's certainly by administration I mean broadly operations, then I guess silence is often the best example of doing a good job. But one of the things that can do is cause you to have a very jaded view of your customers. For example, happy teachers are not going to call the business office because their checks were right. And happy vendors are probably, unless they're looking for new business, are not going to call you up because they got paid on time. The people who are going to call you are the people that have problems. And so over time, we can often have a very jaded view of our own customers because, after all, unhappy people are the only ones who call. So I think we sometimes need to remind our staff that, in fact, I posed it once. I was talking to a group of teachers. You know, it was certainly a different group, but I was doing a workshop for them on actually interacting with parents. And the first example that I gave was I asked them, what do you think of the parents? You know, and this was actually on Long Island, so they were a little grumping about high expectation parents, over demanding parents, unreasonable parents. And then I framed the question differently. I asked the question, I said, would you say that the vast majority of parents are very happy and satisfied with the job you're doing and appreciative of what you do? And they said, oh yes, absolutely. So I think we need to sometimes remind ourselves that there are a few people, first of all, a few people that are difficult and unreasonable, we have to deal with them, and that there are a few people that have problems, and those are the people that are going to be in front of us most. So we need to remember that, you know, for every person that calls us, there's another person that's happy, and not to get that jaded view, okay? And so, of course, I did this one already, but again, I think it's a provocative question. Okay, I'm going to skip it because we had talked about it. But let's talk about this issue of you have to deliver. Now, I'm going to just share a little bit of a personal story with you. And, of course, this is the thing about customer service. We all have our own personal stories. But I think this is very instructive of why it's so important. You got to deliver on the goods. Let me just say from the onset, I think there's lots of situations where organizations, departments, overall, objectively, in the study work I do a very good job, but they don't get their bang for the buck. There's this misperception and misconnect, and we're going to talk about that and how you can align that better by a couple little tweaks that can help, including some things that your staff can do. But that said, I want to just take a minute or two and talk about how you have to deliver. So here's my experience. As you can imagine, I travel a lot on business, but this was actually a personal experience. I was down in Florida, actually in Clearwater, Florida, about maybe 4 or 5 years ago, staying at a Holiday Inn on the beach. And, you know, I'm a pretty understanding guy when it comes to hotels. I understand the idea that things have to break. They, you know, statistically, they might just break when I'm there. So the fact that something is awry doesn't necessarily mean it's bad service or even a bad run operation. But if you come into a hotel room and there are 4 or 5 things that are broken, that reflects a different kind of a sense about how they're maintaining how they're maintaining their hotel. So I had this situation. I won't go into what the items were. They weren't major things, but there were a lot of them. So I called down to the desk, to express my concern. This was after checkout. And I have to tell you, the person at the front desk, they managed my call great. They knew exactly what to say. They obviously have very good training of their front desk staff. I know this stuff because I do it for a living, so I kind of have a sense of having perfect pitch about these things. They were perfect in their assuasion skills and correcting of the mishap, the apologizing. However, no one showed up. So, of course, a couple hours go by. We spent some time on the beach. We arrived back in our room, and nothing's been fixed. So I called down to the desk again. And again, the person at the desk was just so perfect in the way they handled, they knew how to give that double apology perfectly, but the bottom line is nobody came. So finally, at this point, I threatened the thing that usually works, which I threatened not to pay. And at that point, they eventually rustled somebody up who gave me a whole story about the day guy and the night guy and et cetera. And the bottom line is this, okay? By the way, just to add insult to injury on this case, when I checked out, they asked me, so how was your stay? Which is a perfect thing to say under normal circumstances. So at that point, that was more than I could take. And so I hauled off. I kind of complained. The person said to me, I think our our manager would want to hear about that. They handed me a card to fill. I filled out. I never got a reply. By the way, just in all fairness, Holiday, and I finally, after about a month, contacted their central office, and they were really great about following up with the hotel. I got an apology. So my point here is this. The front desk people were terrific. They just did everything right. But at the end of the day, you got to deliver. So, in fact, I had a comment made once about a BOCES. I certainly won't mention which BOCES, but I was doing a study of one of their operations, and I went to visit a couple of their customers because if I'm going to really understand where the disconnect is, and I really have to go and listen to customers first. And by the way, that's another bit of advice too. Don't go to customers to find out whether or not they're happy or unhappy with you. You'll play with those statistics any way you want. My advice is to go to the customers who are not happy with you and ask them why, and then you have to evaluate whether it's them or you. So I didn't want to go to the ones who were happy. I went to the ones who were unhappy. And I remember one assistant superintendent had a biting comment. She said, they're so good at apologizing at this BOCES because they have to do it so often. So while we certainly want to have our staff having good assuasion skills because none of us are perfect and we make mistakes, at some point, if you're having to apologize a lot, you've got to look at what the underlying cause of it is, and you got to deliver, okay? So I'll just leave you with that thought, okay? So you really, right or wrong, fair or not, you got to begin with an honest appraisal about here's another point, too. If you come into an operation and the first thing you've got to do is have an honest appraisal of how customers perceive you. If you're going to get mentally defensive, get into the issue of whether it's our fault or their fault, that's going to get in your way. If there's a negative perception, it could be because of customers' preconceived notions. The key is once you know it, you got to figure out how to work around it, and that's really the key, okay? So I would recommend, and I've said this before, you got to reach out to your most critical stakeholders. You got to try to listen to them, see what it is that concerns them, find out where the disconnect is. And sometimes it isn't an operational disconnect, it's a communications disconnect, but you got to be able to do this. And I would leave you with this thought. People are going to evaluate you through the lens of their prior experiences. And you have to first we have to know what those prior experiences is, and then you got to work more proactively to correct it. So I've got an example to prove that point. It's a good example you can give with your staff. And again, so many of these things are about raising consciousness and giving insight, but I will give you some practical strategies as well. But let me start with just a simple idea I often share in some of the training sessions that I do. I ask people, if any of you know anybody who's been always on time, to a fault, always on time. That's the kind of person they are. If they're supposed to be at they're supposed to be at a meeting at 2:00, they're there at 5 to 2 because that's just their way. Or if they're supposed to meet you for dinner, they're there early. And then, some other people, they're like notoriously late. That's just their very nature. They're notoriously late. Okay, so let's take a hypothetical situation. Suppose that you're supposed to meet someone at 7:00, okay, and it's now 7:10. Now, if it's the first person, that person who's always on time, what's the first thing that goes through your head? Well, most people say what goes through their head is oh, my goodness, I hope they're okay. So that's our reaction to the person who's always on time. What about the person that's notoriously late? There they go again. So the objective event, the fact that they were late, was the same in both situations. But it was the fact that we had a preconceived notion about them that affected how we perceived that event. So if people already have a perception of you as being non-responsive and you're now new in your department, simply changing it isn't going to be enough. it's going to take a lot of time. People are not going to cut you a lot of slack. And, in fact, one of the things that I often ask is, how will people know you changed if they don't have evidence of that change? And they may not have evidence of that change until they have actually a situation. So I often recommend that if you're going to change procedures, change the color of the paper. If you're going to change things, make sure that people have some way of seeing you're new and improved. And that will move this process along. But I will tell you, it is just much harder to rebuild trust than it is to erode it. But it's worth it. You have to take your time. You have to work on it. But sometimes staff can be frustrated because no matter what we do, we feel like people don't give us a clear shake or cut us any slack. And I want to suggest to you that takes time to develop when people have had a prior past experience. So I'll stop, see if anybody has any questions, comments, or political statements before we move on.
Nothing yet.
Did I hear you? Go ahead.
Okay, we've got no comments so far.
I can go on? Okay, good. All right. I like to ask because we get feedback. It's a good thing. Okay, so what I want to try to do is go over with you what I think is the essential elements of good customer service, and then we're going to take care of each one. I'll give you some examples of them. So as I've looked at the issue of service, and again, you got to deliver, but that goes without saying. If we just take that as a given, and you're looking at tweaking customer service, what are the elements of it, and why is it important for staff to really understand these? So here's what I think they are. They're really three things. Three pillars of this kind of it's kind of a stool with three legs. And the first leg is professionalism. It's a sense on the part of people that we have our act together. And the second one, and I'm going to go over each one of these in more detail, so I'll as we get through the slides, I'll go through that. The second one is accuracy, which means that if we're going to give people information, we need to make sure that it's correct information. And the worst situation is when we tell someone that we can't do something and they find out that in fact it's being done. And then the third one is the one that one of the commenters had made about responsiveness. It's turning it around really quickly. So let's try to look at a few of those things and see the things that you can do. Now, again, you're kind of trying to build the strong legs on this stool. So each element you build, you just strengthen those elements as you work along. So let's start with the first one, professionalism, okay? So the question is, what really, that's a perception on the part of our customers that we have our act together. So let me, I always try to give this as a hypothetical, all right? Well, first of all, let's talk about what the benefits of professionalism are. When you project an image of professionalism, that creates a confidence on the part of your customers that you're in a position to be able to solve their problems. And that perception reduces their anxiety. And anxious people are one of our biggest problems because when someone's anxious, the first thing they do is call and write everyone. When someone's calm, they give us some time and cut us a little bit of slack. Not forever, we've got to solve these problems, but they have more confidence in us. So if I have higher anxiety, anxious people write to the Board of Ed, write to 5 different people, actually create more work, follow up again, call us over and over again, which actually impedes us providing service. So anything we do to make customers calm, that's always a good idea, and professionalism is one of the ways that you do that. So let's talk about, from a practical point of view, what professionalism is. Well, if you look at this issue, the old saying about how you can't judge a book by its cover. But in a lot of cases, that's the only thing we really can judge by. People don't really know the inner workings of our operations, so they're going to get a sense of whether they can trust us based on what they can see. And so one of the first things we need to consider is that one of the major points of contact we have with customers is on the telephone, okay? That's probably the place where we have the most contact. In fact, for every person who comes to visit our office, thank goodness, okay, we have a lot more people on the phone. And so I think looking at the issue of how the phone is answered really critical. And I'm going to take a few minutes to go over some stuff with you on that because I think it's important for training your staff. One of the questions I often ask in training, well, one of the comments I'll make first is I'll say, if I were to call a department, and believe it or not, this has happened. It doesn't happen a lot. But every once in a while I'll call a school district and someone will answer the phone, hello. And, of course, when that happens, and that's the exception rather than the rule. It's usually when I've caught somebody off guard. But generally, my first reaction is I've got a wrong number because if someone answers a phone hello, I assume it's not, it's not an organization because most organizations are going to start with some kind of a telephone greeting. So, of course, the question is, do we have a telephone greeting? But more important than that is if you go to organizations that are really well run, what you'll find is that they have a consistent telephone greeting, that everybody in the department or in some cases within the whole district is going to use the same telephone script. So one of the questions I would ask you is there an official telephone script for your office? I mean, I can't ask you to control the whole district, but within the domains that you operate, is there a standard telephone script? Does everybody know it? Is everyone following it? And what should it really look like? Now, one other thing I'll say is I'm going to go over with you what I think is a good phone script. It's certainly a little bit kind of like the Cadillac plan, so to speak. It's probably the most formal one. I tend to be a person who believes a little bit of formality can't hurt. Once I go over it, I can certainly talk about some ways I think you can shave it. But I'd like to at least talk about it because this is one of these areas where I see, even in some very well-run operations, just no one's ever sat down and said, we really need to standardize our telephone greeting. Now, of course, we need to look at also other things, in-person visits, the appearance of our office, whether correspondence, whether or not people write emails and they do them in a formal way, whether or not there are typos on on things that go out. And people are not perfect, but I would suggest to you the phone is probably the easiest thing to fix. The other thing I'll say about the phone is, as somebody in a small business, I always have said the phone is the great equalizer. So let's take a case in point. In doing training work, I used to compete, because they were in this business, with Dun & Bradstreet, a very large corporation doing very similar training as what I was doing. And it should come as no surprise that I could not compete with them on classy office and glass and steel and, and all of that kind of stuff. But here's the thing. When it came to the telephone, I could have a telephone greeting that was just as professional as the most prominent company in the country. And in fact, it was easier for me to do it because with my small staff of 3, I only had to get 3 people in line to do the same thing. Whereas if I'm an organization of 1,000, having that consistent standard becomes more of a challenge. So it's actually one of those things where the smaller you are, the easier it is to do this. And yet I find in a lot of cases it's not an area that people look at. So let me pose again the question if anybody wants to answer. How many of you have a standard telephone greeting that everybody in your, at least within the areas you supervise, that use? Everybody knows it and does it and it's consistent. Anybody want to share?
We have Wendy, actually.
Okay, Wendy.
Wendy?
When our new DS came, he mandated what we were all supposed to say. So not only is it just my unit, it's our entire BOCES that all are to answer the phone in the same way.
How do you feel about that, by the way?
I honestly think it's good because the quote-unquote script that is used identifies not only what BOCES you've reached, but what office you've reached and who you've reached. So you at least have an idea when you start your conversation that you're either in the right or wrong place.
I think that's excellent. And just to share with you, I didn't ask you what BOCES you're with, but you can certainly share that. Which BOCES are you with?
Capital Region.
Terrific. I'm not surprised. They actually are pretty well-run BOCES, in my opinion. I'm not saying any of the others aren't, in case any of you are out there, but I have a lot of respect for the management staff at Capital Region BOCES. Let me just suggest to you, just from prior experience, to share something kind of to add to that or to, back up that. I had been hired a number of years ago by a couple of BOCES, I'll say downstate BOCES, in response to actually a new DS coming in. And there was a sense, this was a DS who had come from one of the districts as a superintendent, and I think that's a benefit because they've been on the other side, they've been on the customer side. And one of the things they said is that we get the impression that, BOCES is a little nameless and faceless, not customer friendly. They weren't saying there was bad service, but there wasn't a sense of customer friendliness. So they asked me to come in to do some training for their office staff, in fact, for all of their staff, on, first of all, on some of the principles I'm sharing with you, but also to look at how they could standardize this script. So the first question I asked was exactly the question that your DS answered. I asked, would you like me to give people some advice on how to answer the phone or tell them how they will do it? And they went with how they will do it, which I think was really important in making the difference. I think this idea that if we just introduce this to people, people will come to it. Your best people will. I think this is one of those things where you need to establish a standard. So I'm all with you, DS. He's a fan. I'm a fan of this person just by basically what you've said. And I have to tell you, there is always a little bit of resistance in the beginning, but it really got noticed. People, without understanding exactly what it was that had changed, people started to talk about this being a kinder and gentler BOCES. So I think you're right on the money, and there's a good message for everyone. When it comes to something like this, it can't be, let's just teach some people some good ideas. I think it's good to establish a standard and insist that people do it. And the only reason I didn't ask you organization-wise, I can't ask you to have more control over than what you have control over. But certainly, even if your organization hasn't reached that point, you can certainly do it within your department. But I'm all for having it district-wide, organization-wide. I think it just makes it easier. So that's terrific. Thank you, Wendy, and thanks for sharing about Capital Region. I always had a great, positive view of them operationally, but that just elevates it one step further. So, yeah, I think it's important to have a consistent greeting. And let's talk about what I think that greeting should look like. So we'll see how close I am to what they did. Sounds like it is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over what I think is a good standardized greeting, and then I'll talk to you about some places where I think you can shave it, okay? So let me start with the first part. I think a salutation. Good morning, good afternoon, or my favorite, which is thank you for calling. Now, the reason I think thank you for calling is good is, and by the way, they're all fine. I'm not so sure I would standardize that, but it's nice to have a salutation. But the reason I like thank you for calling is it avoids that problem around noontime of going, good morning, good afternoon. It's good all the time, and our experience is when people do the same greeting all of the time, it's easier for them. Let me clarify also, internal calls, external calls does not matter. It's still, you should always use a standard greeting. People often say, I'm coming through voicemail. You never know what happens to a call. And in fact, after I go over the parts, I'll tell you a little funny story involving a DS who shared this with me about an experience he had had. But anyway, so a good salutation. The second thing is people need to know where they're calling. And in particular, I'm not only going to talk about BOCES, but I think it's especially important to brand the organization name, brand the district name. I find these people, they almost don't want to be part of their own organization. So I would insist that, for example, somebody not say something like business office, but they say, since I see Joe Dragone here, they would say the Roslyn Union Free School District business office. Or if they're in a district, that you would indicate the name of the district for any central office department. Now, it's culture in schools that when we're talking about a school building, I'm not suggesting that someone needs to say the name of the district, the name of the building, and then the department. Certainly within schools, we normally would give the name of the schools. But if there's a sub-department within the school, I recommend that that department also indicates. So, for example, if we had a guidance department in a high school, I would expect them to say the name XYZ High School Guidance Office, not simply guidance. So people need to know where they're calling, okay? And along with those lines, and some of this stuff it may be a little obvious, but it's amazing how often it happens. We have to make sure that everybody is calling an office the same thing. So let me give you some examples of that I've seen, which is kind of unusual or kind of a reality. The first one is take an HR department. Sometimes we'll have, as you know, colloquially, we may formally have either a Department of Human Resources or a Personnel Department. Usually it's Human Resources. However, some people call it personnel, some people call it human resources. If we've never clarified, that can actually be confusing. People can be confused whether it's a different department, one's internal, one's external. So we need to make sure that everybody within a department is calling that department the same thing. And actually, this sometimes gets tricky at some of the BOCES where you have multi-programs that an office is answering the phone for. You need to try to find a title for that makes some sense and that everybody uses, because that's a source of confusion. Here's another one. There are two possible ways of describing situations. So, for example, someone could call an office, I'm just making up a name, but they could call for Dr. Jones, who's a superintendent. It could be Dr. Jones's office. Or it could be Office of Superintendent. Now, I have no opinion about which of those is better, as long as it's consistent. However, if I have one secretary in the office saying Dr. Jones's office and the other saying Office of Superintendent, that can cause confusion on the part of customers. They can often perceive that one is representing the inside office, the other's, personal secretary. So you need to make sure that everybody's calling the office the same name. Okay, let me go to the third one, who they're speaking to. Now, here again, sometimes people want to hide behind the phones. I think sometimes there's a notion that if they hide behind the phones, they can't be blamed, but I actually believe the opposite is the case. I think it's easier for people to come and blast what they perceive as a nameless, faceless entity versus once they're interacting with a person on a person level. So it tends to actually make some customers, certainly not everybody, but it tends to make some customers a little bit more reluctant to haul off on you when they've established some kind of relationship with you. So giving your name. And I feel strongly about this as well. I believe that, especially for office staff, I would prefer that they gave their full name or that they gave their surname prefix on their last name, but that they not just give their first name. So I'll tell you my reasoning with this, and you make your own choice about what you want to do, but here's why. One of the first, and let me be clear about what those two examples are. One would be saying something like Jeff Olafson speaking or Mr. Olafson speaking, but I wouldn't want to answer the phone Jeff. And here's why. One of the first lessons that I learned in kindergarten, there's that book out, All the Lessons You Learned in Kindergarten, but the first lesson that I learned in kindergarten is that adults in professional positions within schools are addressed by their last name. And in fact, as someone who's traveled across the country, all the way, believe it or not, to doing some training in Alaska, of all places, and I've never been to a place anywhere where teachers are not addressed as Mr. or Mrs. or Ms. So if there's anything that is a norm that's almost universal in schools besides bells and schedules and having kids stay in classes by their age for the most part, I would say it's addressing adults, by their last name in at least formal interactions. So it troubles me a little bit when I have office staff or other types of support staff being a little bit more familiar. I think what it does is it undermines their status professionally. It's kind of related around this concept of juvenilization. If you're in a support level, you're kind of you're only a first name. And I also think it actually undermines their effectiveness, because one of the issues that comes up with staff is whether or not people are going to be comfortable sharing information with them, or if they're going to insist on speaking to you, the SBO. And I think part of what you do to actually allow them to be able to support you better is to have people be a little bit more confident in interacting with them, and they're going to more likely to do that if they perceive them kind of in a higher level. So my recommendation would be, Mrs. Jones or their full name, and not just their first names. But again, that's just my opinion. And then, how may I help you? So let me just run through what this looks like, and then we'll talk about how to, you can kind of tweak it down if you get some pushback from your staff. So it would go something like this. Thank you for calling XYZ School District, Business Office, Jeff Olafson speaking. How may I help you? So so let me just stop for a minute and see if I get any reactions to that, and then I'll go on and give you some of the normal reactions I get from staff when I introduce this to them. Anybody want to comment? Matthew lets me know if I just need to go on. So.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go on. Okay. So normally I'm going to get, I'm trying to anticipate the potential reaction you may get from staff in some cases if you try to do this. The biggest complaint I get from people is that it's a bit long. Okay? So my first comment would be in reaction to that is I think one of the reasons why people perceive it as wrong is because it's new to them. So a long is because it's new to them. And in fact, if you actually took the time to time it, what you discover is the difference between the shortest greeting, which is something like hello, and this one, if you're doing it right, probably about 4 seconds. So we're really not talking about a lot of time. What really occupies someone's time is one upset or angry customer. It's not this kind of stuff. This is not really a big issue, okay? But having said that, if you finally get some pushback from staff that this is just taking too long, what I think you could eliminate, and it's always good, by the way, to this is just a strategy, recommend the longer one, and then when there's some objection, show you're a hero and capitulate a little bit, but in ways you don't care about. And so what I would suggest is you could eliminate the salutation, and that can be accomplished with the lilt in your voice. So I could certainly say, XYZ School District Business Office, Jeff Olson speaking, how may I help you? But I don't think you'd really want to eliminate anything else, because as Wendy had pointed out, these are some really practical things. People need to know where they're calling, and they need to know who they're speaking to. And who would not want to at least establish the framework of starting to, ask, how may I help you? So I think this is, by the way, talk about easy and cheap. There's no budgetary impact here. This is not rocket science. It's a good and fairly easy way to enhance your image. It does require sometimes changing the idea of, we accept whatever we accept. But look at a good example. If you can't get supervision on a standard like this, how are you really going to deal with so many other standards? So as we had talked about in our last session, this concept of rules and norms, boy, this is a great rule one. Getting back to the idea that everybody's going to answer the phone, the right way, and we're going to set a standard. Everybody's going to know it. And if that you're not doing it, I'm going to gently remind you that you need to be better at it until we finally get it to the point where it's a habit. And that's what you see in a lot of organizations, become a habit. So I highly recommend you do this. It's fairly easy. Change it if you're not doing it already. Okay? Just to kind of move on to some other things to look at. One of the goals that we're always looking at as an objective, or one of the goals of your own staff, is to prevent ambush. And in this case, what I mean is preventing administrator ambush, you being ambushed, okay? And here's how you get ambushed. You're going to get ambushed any time that you have to call somebody up, whether it's a vendor or a principal of a building or a teacher or a parent or any of those people. You're calling them back, and you don't know what the problem is, because all that you got from the other end was a message this person was calling. So one of the things that we want to encourage our staff to do is to be able to really take a complete telephone message and to encourage callers to actually share information with them. So I think I probably put it somewhere later, but I want to make sure I get to it because these things always run longer. I can go for 4 hours on them. So I want to talk about, again, a very simple strategy and some basic things. Number one, we need to encourage our staff to get callers to share information, to provide information. And so I recommend the following way. First of all, the way a call normally is going to go, the scenario of a call is someone's going to call up, they're going to ask for you, you're not going to be available, okay, because that's the way it is. We manage by moving around today. We're in the office less. So you're not going to be available. So what you're going to do is the person's going to say, they're going to want to leave a message. So the first thing I always recommend to office staff is that they not ask the person, can I leave a message? Ask if they can help. Is there something I can help you with? Because I have to tell you, and this is, again, when we talk more about responsiveness, we'll see this is one of the things that can really reduce responsiveness. So let's take a hypothetical. Let's assume somebody calls you up, and again, I'll give you all the dutiful credit here, but somebody calls you up, and you're not available, and the staff member simply takes a message rather than really trying to tease out what it is the caller needs. So you call them back later that afternoon when you get back, only to tell them, I'm very sorry, we don't handle this, or only to turn around and hand it to your secretary. or to one of your office staff members to actually do it. So had they known about what the matter was immediately, they might have been able to transfer the person to the right place right away. They might have been able to handle it and cut hours off of the time. So we really need to encourage people to get information from customers. And the first step is to ask them, is there something I can help you with? Okay? Now, there are still going to be customers who are going to be reluctant to share information. Sometimes people are afraid that they're going to be screened out. So because of their concern about being screened out, what they'll often do is they'll, they don't want to say anything. It's a private matter, et cetera. So what I always recommend is that they actually ask people twice. So the first way you ask is to say, is there something I can help you with? Which, if you think about it, is putting the idea in the customer's mind that I might be the person who can actually help them. I don't necessarily have to wait for that business administrator to solve my problem. If they still don't provide the information, what I'll do is I'll begin to take the telephone message, and then as I get to the very end, I'll say something like the following. Is there some information that you can share with me that would help my administrator prepare for the call? Because if you think about it, people are actually quite pragmatic. The reason why they're calling is to get their needs met or their problem solved. And so if you give them a good reason, that'll often open them up. Even if all they do is give you a little cryptic information, it still might be useful information for you. I mean, the optimal situation would be for you, by the time you call them up, to already have been able to look into the matter, have a resolution. Maybe in some cases you don't even have to be the one to return the call. You can have a secretary return to say, just to let you know, we've looked into it, it's all been resolved, etc. So there are so many advantages in promoting the notion of preventing ambush, okay? And it's a practice thing. But we really don't want people to quickly offer to take a message. We want to offer them to help first, and I think that's the first step. Okay, beyond simply preventing ambush, and I talked about this briefly when I go back to it again, though, and give you a real practical strategy for how to address this, and that is reducing anxiety. You know, customers call up because they have a problem that they want resolved. And the fact of the matter is that lots of times you cannot resolve those things instantly for them. It's going to take time to look into it. Or in some cases, if you're not in the office, the only one who can really resolve it is you. But the person who they're reaching now is one of your staff members. And so what can that staff member do in the interim to create a better situation? Even though we may not be able to solve problems right away, we can certainly work on reducing anxiety immediately. And so the key to reducing anxiety is that people have confidence that we're going to manage the matter. Now, it's a little tricky because people often don't want to make a commitment they can't make. So a confidence statement, in fact, I'll slip to the next slide, is what I call a confidence statement. Okay? So here's an example. Somebody, and there's lots of them, by the way, but somebody makes a comment to the effect that you haven't been good about getting back to them. Say you haven't returned my, he hasn't returned my call or she hasn't returned my call. So what I would expect a good secretary to say is, I'm very sorry, of course good to apologize, and then say, I know he's been very busy or she's been very busy, but they would want to, what they would want to hear from you. Let's see what, let me take down your name and number. I'll make sure as soon as they come in that I give them the message again. So I don't want to promise a call back, but I want to, give a little confidence statement. Here's another one. I'll just tell you one that I thought was about the best one I'd ever heard, and I think I'll leave it to you to figure out what to do beyond that. We had a parent calling up a pupil personnel department. You can understand these are the parents of children with special needs. It's an anxiety situation for them just naturally, worrying about their child. And so, of course, the parent had a concern. They were very anxious. They were talking to the secretary, and, of course, the secretary couldn't necessarily make a promise that they were going to get the right placement for the kid, and, et cetera. But here's what this secretary said. I thought it was the absolute best answer I ever heard. Here's what she said. She said, the staff in this department, meaning the guidance counselors and the pupil personnel staff, they are some of the most thoughtful and caring people I've ever met in my entire life. If there's a solution, they'll find it. So when you get a secretary making a statement like that, supportive of their boss, expressing confidence in their boss, expressing confidence in their coworkers, expressing confidence in their district. That does a lot to reduce the anxiety of a person. Now, again, that's not a solution. You got to eventually solve their problem. But sometimes that can prevent a person from turning around as soon as they get off the phone and starting to dial the superintendent's office or dialing board members. We can cut the little bit off in the past. It gives us a little bit more slack. So we need to train staff on giving a confidence statement. Some of the worst things that staff can sometimes say are things like, I don't know, nobody tells me anything, or who knows, I don't know, you'll have to talk to him about it. And while none of those are formally incorrect, they are not anxiety producing. So we need to try to work with our staff on training them to reduce customer anxiety. And by the way, let's talk about how you practically do this. The best way to do this, and this is another point I want to make, is you really do need to have regular staff meetings with your staff. And when you have those meetings, if you're only going to focus on procedural things, then that's what people are going to focus on. If you emphasize in your staff meetings sometime for service, that will become important to people. So what you spend your time on in staff meetings, very important. This is not kind of stuff you can do in a memo. You have to really sit down. You have to problem solve with people. And I had a boss once who was terrific at this. What he would do is every time we had a meeting, and they were not long meetings, and these were not long discussions. They were part of what he did. We would sit down and discuss an incident that happened. And the key was not about blame. That's about the past, and we want to focus on the future. But he would say, if this would have happened in the future, how could we have handled it better? And lots of times we would brainstorm. We'd say, well, we could have handled it this way. We could have managed it that way. And a lot of it really related around how to handle situations in the interim, expressing confidence in the meantime. So let me stop again, see if I have any questions, comments, or thoughts on the use of confidence statements. By the way, good idea for board members, too. I see when I was a school board member in Westchester County, and I learned something that I thought was really helpful. Of course, I was supposed to read my board packet from cover to cover every Friday, but to be honest, sometimes they got a little thick. And and I tried, but sometimes sometimes someone would tap me on the shoulder and they'd ask me about something that was going on in the district, And now what I could have answered, which was an honest answer, is I don't really know. But that would have made me look bad and would have made my superintendent look bad because it would have suggested they hadn't kept the board in the loop. So what I would say is, I'm not privy to all of the details at this point. I'm familiar with it, but I'm sure they're working on it. Let me get your name and number, and I'll have someone contact you. So I expressed confidence in my leadership team in the district, and that really went a long way towards building support for schools. So these strategies are important no matter what your level is. And by the way, we need to, even within the business office, staff needs to express confidence in other staff. So if very often what will happen is one staff member, somebody will have a complaint with one staff member, and they will vent to another staff member. And while I think we all know we're not supposed to do these things, people tend to do them. It's a funny story. Somebody told a story. They were talking about another staff member within the same department, and the response from the staff member who was on the phone line hearing the complaint was, well, you think that was bad? So, we can eat our own a little bit. So when someone makes a complaint about someone else in my department, first thing I do is I use a confidence statement, which can be really hard if I agree with the caller, but I do it anyway. And then what I try to do is focus on solving their problem. I say, let's see what we can do to get this fixed. So this is a really good and powerful tool, and a lot of people don't think of it. So let me stop, see if anybody has just a general comment on that.
As a reminder, you can use the chat window to the right of the main screen or hit 7# on your phone.
I guess that means no.
Yep.
Wants to make a comment, but that's okay. That's all right. All right. So just on a quick one on this one, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but I think it's important to remind people about all of the particulars. One of the things that I've discovered is a big issue with service is predictability. For example, this is just a simple example, and I see this a lot with business offices. I see it a lot with with technology departments. I see it with facilities departments. And it's never about big emergency items because those things we jump on. It's always about more moderate things. But here's the hypothetical. Somebody calls up. They ask you for something. Can you take care of this thing for me? Can you forward this to me or handle this for me? And I tell them, okay, I'll take care of it. If I do that, at what point do they decide I'm late? Okay. And I would suggest to you that they tend to decide you're late in a very unrealistic framework. And in fact, this can be a cause of a lot of conflict between staff internally because of this kind of miscommunication. So let me give you a case in point. Let's say that there's a teacher that asks for something that requires that a staff member complete something that's ready to go to the school board by the next meeting, or ready to go to the school board or ready to go to the state. And so the staff member says, I'll take care of that, okay? And because they're extremely dedicated and they really want to give good service, they really bust, haul off, really, clear their schedule to get this thing done, and it takes them 2 days to do it, okay? Because it just normally takes 5 days, but they do it in 2 days, okay? With everything else they absolutely must do. Well, that staff member thought this was something he could do in an hour. So by the end of that day, the person is calling up and they're saying, where is it? I haven't gotten it. Now the person who's been killing themselves trying to get this done is now resentful, and there you go. For 12 years, they're kind of looking askance at each other in the staff lounge. So what was the cause of the problem? The problem is a disconnection between expectation and delivery. And a lot of times what drives that is an absence of a clarity about what the expectation should be. So I think it's really important. If I tell any customer that I never say to somebody, I'm going to take care of something. I always say, I'll have that to you no later than, okay? And I'm really specific about that. Now, sometimes what happens is staff members are reluctant to do that because they feel they can't commit. Well, I would suggest to you that if you don't commit, you probably create the worst possible context because people are almost inevitably going to assume that things were easier to do and simpler. They don't understand your work. So we need to make sure that we get into the habit of really letting people know when we can do something, okay? Now, of course, I always tell people you got to use the Star Trek model, which is, I don't know if we have any Star Trek fans here, but I always talk about the Star Trek model. And basically what the Star Trek model says is, this is the original Star Trek for them, an old-timer. So it goes like this, Captain Kirk would call down to Scotty, and we'd say, I need more warp power. And Scotty would always say, I don't think my engines could take it. And I'm telling you, he knew he could do it. His theory was, you promise less, you deliver more. If you say, sure, I can do it, and it doesn't work, then you get blamed. So I always tell people, be conservative in your estimates. If there's a problem and people don't want to accept the time frame you've demanded, they'll let you know. But most of the time, provided something they can live with, they'll generally judge you by the criteria you set. So if you tell someone it'll be 5 days, they'll accept 5 days. So if you think it's going to take you 5 days, tell them 7. If they come and complain, you can always turn around and say, okay, let me see what I can do, shuffle some papers. Okay, I can get it done in 5. You're a hero again. Now, I will tell you, I probably shouldn't give out my secrets, but I always do this. If I get a superintendent requesting a proposal from me, I always tell him I probably won't get to it until next week. And then I try to get it done right away because, frankly, I want it off my plate before I forget about it or something else comes along. I've never had anybody say to me, you said it would take until next week. What did you get to me so soon? In fact, I've had the opposite. I've had people actually thanking me for my prompt responses. So that's another kind of a little trick. Here's another one. And, again, we talked about establishing standards. Okay? There are going to be times when I will tell something, I can get something done by a certain date, and I'm not able to do it because things come up. So the guiding principle you've got to go back to the person beforehand and tell them, I'm sorry, I thought I could have it to you by tomorrow. It's probably going to take me an extra couple of days. Almost always they're fine with this. The more people come to have confidence in me, in a sense that they know that if I tell them it's Wednesday, it's going to be Wednesday, the less they feel the need to follow up, call again, check again. And in fact, if you have a lot of that, if you see that within a certain culture, You have a lot of people checking to make sure things were done. I can almost guarantee you that there's a historical basis for that in some situation in which people couldn't, either they weren't told what to expect or they couldn't rely on that. So that's another area where we need to really tighten up. You got to make and keep commitments. You can't let deadlines pass. And a lot of this is not about how much harder we work, because we're going to get things done just about the same pace we always did, but it's about the communication piece of predictability. And I can't tell you, this has probably been more of an area where I see, say, technology departments and facilities departments lose confidence in customers. It's not on service delivery. It's not about the objective element of how quickly they got the work done. Here's just an interesting irony with that. A lot of times, we have these people, and they tend to focus on the work. If they're a technician, they tend to focus on getting that computer repaired. If they're a facilities person, they focus on getting that, maintenance guy, they focus on getting that thing fixed. They don't think about the human dynamics. I constantly remind them that you always have two jobs in any situation involving a customer. The first is to reduce their anxiety. The second is to fix the problem. And if you don't do the little missteps on reducing anxiety by telling people when they can expect service, you're going to have more complaints floating up to the superintendent's office. And by the way, I hope I'll get to this slide, but it's in the materials, but bad news travels up. You tell someone I'm not going to get, I'll be done by, I'll have it done by this certain date, or they assume it's going to be. As soon as it isn't, they make a call. And then the following minute you show up, they're happy, but the people up above already got a negative perception, and it's hard to break those. So we need to think about this key of expectations tied to reality. Let me again ask any questions on that before we move on. I'll try to pick up the pace so we get as much of it done as we can. Any questions, comments? No?
None so far.
Oh, okay. I'll take that as a good thing. Who knows? All right. The question I often ask is, I actually went over this before, can we really say that good service is giving people what they want when we operate in a regulatory environment and a policy environment in which frequently we can't give people what they want because what they want is illegal or against policy? So what is the substitute for giving people what they want? And the answer is it's accuracy, telling people the truth and making sure that we know that. I can't tell you there's nothing that really angers people more than being told something like, I'm sorry, that can't be done, we can't do that, and they only find out that, in fact, it can be done because they do their own research or et cetera. Now, I'll tell you a quandary I haven't figured out how to solve, to be honest, but I just want to point it out because it could be cause of the problem. What I found to be a real difficulty on occasion is I have a staff and they're doing their job. They're reading the policy, and the policy says the following is not supposed to be done. And so when they tell someone, I'm sorry, we can't do this, they are following policy. The problem is the policy is being universally violated by other people. So in effect, when we give them the answer telling them no, we're giving them the right answer. But it happens to be not what everybody else has experienced, and they're not going to get that. So that's an internal problem I think you got to discuss with the higher-ups. We need to really look at what happens. This is another consequence of what happens when we have things that are in writing and they're policies and they get violated by some staff and then other staff stick to the letter of the rule. It just creates confusion and frustration and bad perception. So we need to clarify those. There shouldn't be 5 answers to a question. There shouldn't be the real policy and the real deal if you scream. But that's another matter. So something else to look at. Okay. A couple of other things I say is, this is just basically the same thing. Okay, responsiveness. Minimizing the time between the time that a customer makes an inquiry to when they get a response. And again, I think we all can understand what that is, but let's talk about some of the things that can get in the way of responsiveness. Well, one of them is faulty systems, the simplest things, like not having an up-to-date telephone directory. It's interesting. If you're in a very tiny district, it's pretty simple. You're in a 400-student district with one small office where everybody knows each other, and someone asks a question about who handles this particular matter, it's not too hard to figure out who it is. But when you get into some of these large districts or large organizations like a large BOCES or even a large school district where there's an enormous division of labor, oftentimes there can be, not everybody really has up-to-date knowledge about who handles what and what comes up next. And so I will tell you that one of the things that's a great source of frustration for people is when they get transferred around a lot. And in fact, if you transfer someone 3 times, my experience has been I always by that point have gotten cut off. And then when calling up, I'm already really, really angry. So part of what you can do, and again, I'm trying to talk about simple things, is first of all, make sure that your telephone directory is up to date, and make sure that it's cross-referenced, so that it's not just referenced by department, but also by site. So if someone's looking for a particular employee, and you don't have to look through 12 pages to figure out which department they're in because you got to cross-reference by name. Okay? That's one simple thing. Second thing, I think it's worthwhile organizationally to spend some time training your staff about who does what, especially if we're getting common calls about this. So, for example, if you know that you tend to get common calls that really appropriately belong with HR or pupil personnel or other departments, you need to make sure that people know if you get this kind of call, you handle it in this way, this should go here, this should go there. Now, you can never solve 100% of these. There's always a new request you'll never know about. So I certainly can't fault people for the first time they get an inquiry, they're not familiar with it, they don't know what to do, so they send it off to the superintendent's office just for lack of knowing what to do with it. But that shouldn't happen a second time. If I get a call from someone and I'm not sure who handles it, I need to make it up, put it on a list, and I need to find out who it is. And that may be something else that you might want to talk about just quickly in your training or in your staff meetings. Are we getting calls? We're not sure who handles it. Let me clarify. I had one organization, by the way. It was not a BOCES, but it was like it in Connecticut. And they're very, very large. So you can imagine they deal with a lot of these issues involving silos. It wasn't just with office staff either. It was all staff. And they really felt, the leadership people, that maybe we're missing some opportunities because people were getting floating around with a new opportunity, and someone said, we don't even handle this, or I don't know who handles it, and they went elsewhere, you know. So they actually they had something that they call like a staff appreciation day. And on that staff appreciation day, they actually had each department do a little presentation for the whole rest of the staff on what our department does, what services we're doing, what programs we're running. And it's amazing how many people had worked in the organization for years had absolutely no idea. We do this, we can handle, we service migrant people. And you never know. That might be an opportunity for business that might have been lost because somebody really wasn't aware. So good idea to make sure that people have good knowledge about who handles what. Let me talk about another element of responsiveness. There's various levels of responsiveness about different things. And this is the example I'm giving here probably would be most appropriate for facilities folks or maintenance folks, or technology folks. And I mention these because I know some of you supervise those folks as well. So what I'd like to do is give you an example of this being done well, and I think that'll highlight it. Well, probably the best example I can give is my old copier company when I was in the city, because I think they did a really good job of this. So here's what would happen. I would call the copier. They had a help desk. They would then forward the call to a technician, who, of course, is in the field doing various things. Okay? The technician would call me back immediately to tell me they couldn't come for 2 hours. But I would make a contact with that technician, so I knew they would always tell me where they were. They would tell me or they give me some info like, I have 3 more calls to do. I expect that I'll be with you within 2 hours. I think they always figured they could do it in an hour, so they added an hour, always a good idea. But they would get back to me immediately, even if they had to tell me that it wasn't going to be for a while. So even though we may not be able to solve problems for people right away, we can always get back to them right away. Now, I'll tell you who else is really good at this, AAA. And they've really understood this concept of reducing anxiety. You're stuck somewhere on the road, you're anxious, you know what's going to happen. In the old days, what you used to do is you talk to a dispatcher, they would tell you it'll be about 45 minutes. Now you're wondering, do they really know where I am? Okay, so here's what they do now. And they did this because they did good research. They listened to their customers. And they understood that the problem was not how quick they could come. They can't change how fast they come. What they could change is the anxiety factor. So what they did is you call up now, and the first thing they do is, and part of his technology helps this too, is they will actually try to help identify where you are. So they have MapQuest and everything. They'll try to help figure out where your cross streets are. They don't make you go out on some vacant road if they can help it. Second thing is they tell you what service station is going to come and who is the name of the technician, because the moment you already have a sense of a real person, you feel much better. Then what they do is they forward a call to that technician who's out there probably fixing someone else's car, and they call you back right away. And they call you back to tell you their name. They call you back to tell you they know where you are because you're local and they know what street that is, and they tell you they'll be there in an hour. So they don't get there any sooner. But during that hour, you're less anxious. And so we need to make sure that even if we can't fix problems any faster, we need to make sure that we get to people and let them know what to expect and that we're on it quicker. Okay? Then there's another one. Did we arrive as promised? And then how quickly did we solve the problem? Now, here's just another quick, misstep that I saw recently. And again, these are just little strategies you need to remind people of. There was a boiler that was out in a school building. So a maintenance guy comes in, and boilers are a pretty serious thing, especially in the winter. Cold children, not a good thing. So what happens is he rushes down to the boiler to go fix the boiler. Now, these problems don't get fixed in 5 minutes. What he forgot to do was go by the office to tell him that he had arrived. So he was there for over an hour, and they were convinced no one had came. By that point, they had called the superintendent's office, they had called his boss, they had called a couple of other places. So meanwhile, he was working on the problem. So we need to make sure that people know when we arrive, even if we haven't solved the problem right away. So again, raising people's consciousness about responsiveness, tying it to reducing anxiety, very important, okay?
We have no comments.
Go ahead. A comment or question?
Nope, no comments.
Oh, okay, good. All right. I'm just moving on because I think these are things I've kind of covered already. I want to emphasize again, bad news travels up. Okay? Unfortunately, good news doesn't always travel up. If you do a good job, and you finish, people aren't necessarily going to call you superintendent to commend you. But if something goes wrong, they'll go over your head. They're going to go over your department. And then you've got to go and justify. And in fact, it's interesting. Oftentimes, people at the top have a more negative view of operations than the point of contact people. And the example of what might cause that is, I told someone I'd arrive at 1. At 1:05, 1:02, they called the superintendent's office. At 1:03, I arrived. They're happy as a clam. I solved their problem. They don't bother to call the superintendent's office to tell them I arrived. So you have this on a cumulative basis, and the people at the top have a more negative view of perception of your department or your operation. That can be a problem. So some of that is unsolvable. It's unavoidable to a certain extent. But here's the key. Our goal is to prevent those calls from traveling up. The calmer people are, the fewer those calls that go up. And that could really make a difference between, frankly, between you getting tenure or not, between there being a real negative perception of your department by a board and superintendent or not. So we need to not make sure that we're answering these questions. We really try to avoid having to cut them off at the pass. And part of that has to do with tying it into responsiveness. Okay, what are some of the causes of this? Faulty systems, tunnel vision, somebody doesn't really care about anything else, insufficient training, or staff conflicts. Frankly, sometimes staff will make other staff look bad because of their own individual issues, and they miss the picture that at the end of the day, no one's really going to make a distinction. They're not going to say, this guy's good and this guy's bad. This is a good staff member. At the end of the day, we sink and swim together. So we need to remind staff of that. Whatever issues we might have outside, we really need, it never is a benefit when somebody has a negative perception of my coworker, and that won't help me. So we need to think about things like good systems, staff ownership of the mission, establishment of standards, and customer focus. And these things are not going to happen simply because you mention it in a few meetings. We need to supervise it. We need to see when things are not working, and we need to address them to people. We need to tell them they need to be a little bit better. Okay, and that's just the truth. And so it requires nurturing and support, and it requires leadership. Leadership matters. Okay. What often I'll ask is, and I hear this a lot, people say, I still think we give good service, but there's a negative perception of our department. And and it's not, there's no objective evidence for it. So what can I really do to address that? Anybody I'll take a quick, anybody have a comment in general on that, had an experience with that, where you felt like you were doing good work and you just were not getting the credit?
No comments.
No comments. Oh, I should actually be able to get through most stuff. Okay. So I'd like to suggest to you a couple of things to think about if you feel there are some differences between perception and reality. And the first of them I'd like you to think about is part of it is educating the customer. And I've talked about that a little bit. When I tell someone it's going to take 5 days to do something, that's a part of educating the customer. Or here's another part of educating. By the way, a common reason for misperception is that people tend to blame us for things we don't even do. So, in fact, another department handles it, and they're not so good at it, and we're great, and so we take the blame. And this can often happen where you take the blame for things that are not your fault. So, for example, you take the blame for some improvements in things that really are Verizon's fault, or they're being held up at the state level and not at a local level, and yet you take the blame for it. Now, I have to tell you, to a certain extent, you never really inoculate yourself from that. You kind of always own it a bit, so this is not a perfect situation. But I think to the extent to which we can let customers know in little subtle ways, we can maybe mitigate this a little bit. So here's one example. If I know that the bottleneck is always with the state on some kind of a thing that I need to submit, I'll make sure that customers know when I've sent it up. So I'll send them a little email that says, just to let you know, we forward your paperwork on to the state. It normally takes this many weeks. Rather than to simply tell them it takes this many weeks, I let them know when I've completed my end. So that's a way for me to educate the customer the problem's not coming at my fault. And I may not blame the state. I'll simply provide the evidence and hope they put two and two together. So I think that's one way. The other way is treating perception as reality. One of the things that we need to be aware of is that people are going to make assumptions based on what they see. And based on those assumptions, things are going to follow that are problematic. Now, I've been doing a lot of training lately. I did a lot over the summer. And if there's been one central theme of my training this summer with everybody, it's that you cannot afford to look dispensable. Or should I say, look dispensable. You cannot afford to look dispensable. So when the classic example of that is somebody is on a break, and certainly people are entitled to have their breaks. So they're on a break and they're sitting at their desk or they're sitting in front of a school building and they're reading the newspaper. And you know what they say about Murphy's Law. If you're reading the newspaper in front of the building, that's just the one time that the board president's going to come swinging by and he's going to see you. And if he sees you, he's not going to ask you whether you're on a break. He's going to make a perception that you're on school time and you're reading the paper. And if you could be reading the paper on school time, maybe we don't need as many of you. And once somebody has an idea in their head like that, sometimes all the statistics to prove otherwise really hurts us. So I think we need to, in this environment, point out to staff that we can never afford to look busy, unoccupied. So if I'm sitting in the hallway having a chat for a long time and people are seeing that, that's a problem for me. Let me make another point about that. The problem today is not going to be from the public. It's going to be from somebody else within your schools. Schools are facing tough economic pressures. I don't have to tell you this. You know that better than I do. And what's happening is a lot of jobs are on the line or looking like they may be on the line. And so if I'm turning around and I'm thinking and then the rumblings are out that there could be cuts in teaching staff or cuts in nurses or cuts in whatever, any of those people are going to be looking for someone else to zero in on. So the problem is not going to be from the public. It's going to be from somebody else in the staff who's just going to love to go into the lounge and say, well, why did they let go of me? Why don't they get rid of those people? We see they don't do anything all day long. So we need to raise the consciousness of our staff that we need, especially in front of customers, we cannot appear as if we're not busy all the time. We're not working all the time. Okay, and I'll just give you an example of this. I went to a school district, I won't mention it by name, only a couple of weeks ago, and a big issue with cell phones, people using cell phones, and I had a conversation with someone last week about this as well, okay, about people using cell phones. And I'll tell you, I'll take this on a couple of levels. It's one level if somebody is using a cell phone and they see me walking by or they see the superintendent walking by and they try to hide it. That's not half bad. But if it's gotten so bad that they don't even bother to hide it, that's really problematic. Now, I'm not saying there aren't exigent circumstances. Someone's got an ill parent or an ill child, and I want to know about that. But in the absence of knowing that, I expect that you're not going to be doing anything that doesn't look like schoolwork. And there's no reason. Cell phones are not part of schoolwork unless you're a facilities person or a field person. So a person should not be sitting in their office making calls. They can go on their break. They should do them away from their desk, because the key here is this notion of if you have to explain, you're already wrong. Okay? And the simplest idea is this. People are going to come by. They're going to see things. They're going to notice them. They're not going to know whether you're on a break or not. They're just going to make a conception, and once they do that, that just travels around. So we need to raise the consciousness. Now, if you notice in the slide, I put a picture of the Disney castle up here, and there's a reason I did it. It's not just because I love Disney, actually. But the reason I put it up is because I often call this the Disney concept, and that's what Disney calls it. Disney comes out of, this is the way they train their staff, is they remind them that they're in show business and that there's two conditions that always exist, and that is on stage and off stage. What you do when you're on stage and what you do when you're off stage. And when you're on stage, it's fine for you to put your feet up and relax, but when you're on stage, you go into that park, you're supposed to be a picture-perfect image of that position. And that is the standards that we need to set. If it doesn't look like what we think is the personification of a perfect person in that position, then I'm going to address it with you. And I'm going to tell you should have done it on your break, you should have done it away. So we need to raise the standards about that. And this explanation proof, things need to appear right without the need of any kind of explanation, is a standard that we need to set. I'm only going to do one more thing with you, and then we'll kind of wrap up. I'll leave a couple of minutes for questions in case there's anything in the end, just to give you some tips on misconceptions. And maybe if I ever get to come back with this group again, we'll do some things in dealing with upset and angry customers. I did give you some stuff on that, but we don't have time for that now. But common things. So we're just going to talk about some things, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, I'm going to talk about the L word, the C word, and the V word. Okay, and these are things to avoid. So these are situations where someone calls up, they're looking for an administrator, they're looking for someone, and they're not available, what we should or shouldn't say. Okay, so how many of you have heard someone say, he's out to lunch? Okay, well, you can, I always kind of laugh at that anyway because people go out to lunch. Well, we've known that for years, So let's forget for a moment that. How about somebody being at lunch? I'm suggesting it's not a good idea to say he's at lunch, and I'll tell you why. The moment you use the word lunch, it's like you create a little artificial clock. And so if someone calls up at 11 and the person says he's at lunch, and the same person calls up at 12:30, and in fact you returned and then went back out, I guarantee you that person's what's going through their minds is long lunch. So we need to not use the L word. If somebody's not available, we need to say they're out of the office. I expect them back in about an hour. And I'll just do the next one, which is the C word. I hear a lot of people saying he's at a conference. Well, I have to tell you, I have no problem with conferences. It's what I do for a living. However, conference means a very different term in industry. And remember, people always interpret a word not by what you interpret it as, but what they interpret it as. And in industry, conference is a gift. It's the salespeople going off to Hawaii on a little vacation. So when people hear the word conference, the first thing that goes through their head is administrators, staff members partying it up. So we need to not say that. We need to say away from the district on district business. And I'll just do V as the vacation word. I especially have some concerns about that with the business office. I know you folks, it's hard for you to get off with the summer with audits. The problem I have is you take a vacation in October, which is there's never a good time for a business official to take a vacation. But if you take a vacation when school's in session, the notion for some people is, well, you had the whole summer off, et cetera. So you may want to think a little bit about whether you want to share that information. I know we only have a couple of minutes left. Let me just stop and see if there's any questions, and I thank you for your time.
Okay, if you have any final questions for Jeff, please hit 7# on your phone or use the chat window to your right. All right, looks like everyone's good.
All right, that's good. We made it on time with 1 minute to spare. Wow, talk about efficiency. Anyway, thank you all for your time. I appreciate it, and I hope you'll attend more opportunities for webinars through New York State ASBO. It's a terrific opportunity. Support your state association. Have a wonderful day.
Everyone, thank you very much for attending. The next webinar in this series is next Monday, same time, same place. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Thank you again.
The moderator has ended the conference. Goodbye. Thank you for calling.